fiancé bonded with my cheating father behind my back. I threatened to cancel our engagement unless he stopped seeing him. I'm a 27-year-old woman and I have always had a complicated relationship with my dad, who's now 55. He wasn't a bad father to me growing up, but he was a terrible husband to my mom. Some of my earliest memories are of seeing my mom in tears after discovering that dad had cheated on her yet again. It was like a cycle. Dad would cheat, mom would find out and lash out, and then dad would make jokes to lighten the mood. Sometimes he'd even laugh it off while she was still furious, which only made things worse. Yet somehow, within days, they'd go back to being normal, at least until the next time she caught him. Over time, I started to really resent my dad for hurting my mom over and over. If I'm being honest, I even resented my mother a little for always forgiving him, for putting herself through so much pain. After college, I moved back in with my parents because I wasn't stable financially yet. During that time, I met a guy who I really liked, and he wound up spending a lot of time at my parents' house. I noticed that he and my dad clicked almost immediately. My dad loved having him around. They were always hanging out, planning fishing trips, or going camping together on weekends. I thought it was really wonderful to see them getting along so well. But then, one day, I overheard them talking about one of their so-called camping trips. My heart dropped as I realized their adventures weren't just about hanging out in the woods or fishing. They were picking up women together. Dad, my own father, was encouraging my boyfriend to cheat on me and just keep it discreet. When I confronted them, they tried to deny it, but I wasn't stupid. I ended that relationship on the spot. My relationship with my dad got even worse after that. I moved out a few months later, and even though my new place was just a 20-minute drive away, I could barely bring myself to visit, mostly, truthfully, because of my mother and how seeing her made me feel. Things took a turn when I met my fiancé, who's now 26. I was still nursing the emotional wounds from my last relationship when he came into my life. We dated for about a year and a half, and then he proposed. He knew all about my strained relationship with my dad and what had happened with my ex. A month ago, right before Thanksgiving, we got engaged. I broke the news to my mom, and she was so excited, she begged us to come spend Thanksgiving weekend with them to celebrate. She said it would be a chance to reconnect, since we'd grown so distant. My fiancé encouraged me, and so I agreed. On our first night there, after dinner, my dad invited my fiancé out onto the porch to have a beer and talk. My mom and I joined them for a while, but after an hour of listening to them talk football, I couldn't take it anymore. My mom excused herself to bed, and not long after, I told my fiancé I was heading to sleep. He said he'd join me soon, but I felt uneasy about leaving him alone with my dad. Still, I didn't want him to think I didn't trust him, so I went to bed. Much later, my fiancé slipped into our room, accidentally waking me up. When I asked why he'd gotten to bed so late and what they could possibly have been talking about for so long, he just shrugged and said it was all about football. I let it go. All weekend, he and my dad were thick as thieves, running errands together, helping with chores. When I finally mentioned it, my fiancé insisted he was just being polite. Yesterday, though, he told me he was planning to go on a camping trip with a friend. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. He's gone on camping trips before, but this time he was being evasive. When I pushed him about who he was going with, he confessed it was my dad. Apparently, since Thanksgiving, they'd stayed in touch without telling me. They even went to a football game together, and my dad specifically told him not to tell me because I'd make a big deal out of it. I completely lost it when I heard that. I reminded him of what happened with my ex, and made it clear why I did not want him hanging out with my father. My fiancé accused me of being paranoid and said that my dad had never said anything inappropriate, that he was just a fun guy to hang out with. He insisted that my dad never forced my ex to cheat, and that I shouldn't keep holding a grudge. That stung so much, especially when he refused to cancel the camping trip. I told him, point blank, that he could either stop hanging out with my dad or I would call off our engagement. Now, he's upset, says I'm controlling, and that if I really think my dad could influence him, I must not trust him at all. The tension has been unbearable, we barely talk. I feel torn. I never set out to be the kind of woman who tries to control who my partner can or can't spend time with, but I set this boundary about my dad from the very beginning. He knew exactly how it made me feel. Update 1. I didn't break up with my fiancé right away. Pathetic, I know. I've been with this man for almost 2 years, and we'd never had any major fights until now. I kept hoping he'd eventually see where I was coming from, that he'd realize the weight of my boundaries and decide to cut my father off. But 2 days later, he was still giving me the cold shoulder. Every time I tried to talk things out, he just shut down. He'd told me it wouldn't just be him and my dad on that trip, his friend would be there too, so I wouldn't have to worry. As if that was supposed to fix everything. But to me, that missed the whole point. It finally snapped when a text buzzed on his phone while he was in the shower. It was from my father. Has she cracked yet? That was the moment I finally saw it clear as day. My fiancé had teamed up with my dad, giving me the silent treatment to force me into submission. He had no intention of calling off the trip, no intention of choosing me or my boundaries, he just wanted me to give in. Something inside me broke open, but it wasn't anger. It was like a numb, unstoppable clarity. I quietly took off my ring and placed it on the nightstand. When he came out, I waited until he looked at me and calmly told him that I needed him to move out by the end of the week. Immediately, he scrambled and tried to claim I was being unreasonable, that I was turning into a controlling woman. I told him I wasn't trying to control his life, that's why I was asking him to leave. I explained that he could be friends with whoever he wanted, but I couldn't be with someone who trampled my boundaries and thought it was fine to keep company with someone who hurt me so deeply. He changed tactics in an instant. Suddenly, he was ready to cancel the trip, to stop talking to my dad, anything to keep me from leaving. For a split second, I'll admit, I was tempted, I almost buckled. But I forced myself to stand my ground and told him it was over. Then I left the apartment, heart racing, and drove straight to my parents' house. The calm I had felt before vanished. I stormed in and unleashed years of hurt and anger on my father for being a complete puss, for cheating on my mom, and now for sabotaging my relationship all over again. Of course, he felt no remorse. Everyone who said he did this to prove a point, turns out they were absolutely right. My father looked me in the eye and said if I thought I could find a man satisfied with only one woman forever, I was living in a fantasy. In his mind, all men want variety every now and then. I was prepared for that, I knew he'd say something abysmal. But what crushed me wasn't him, it was when my own mother agreed with him. She calmly told me that I'd never find the perfect man, that all men cheat, but what matters is that he loves you and comes home to you at the end of the day. In the past, I'd felt resentment toward my mom for putting up with so much crap from my dad, but never before had I looked at her and felt pure disgust, until that moment. I quietly told her she was wrong. Maybe she was resigned to living with a cheater, but I knew I deserved far better. I told my father I didn't care if he cut me off or disowned me, I wanted nothing to do with him ever again. And to my mother, I said I loved her, but until she could find the self-respect to leave my father, I couldn't have a relationship with her either. After that, I drove to my best friend's house and just broke down completely. Sorry if this feels choppy. I've lost two of the people I cared about most, and it hurts like hell. Still, I know, after everything I've put up with, I have to finally put myself first. And just like most of you, my best friend suggested therapy. So, I'm going to try that. One last thing, I know that, legally, I owe my ex-fiancé a month's notice since he moved in with me 7 months ago, but there's no way I can last that long. I just hope he leaves within the week and doesn't make things worse. For now, I'll be staying at my friend's place. Update 2. I didn't wait around to see whether I was being paranoid. I left a short text for my ex-fiancé with 2 times he could come get his things with a civil standby, and told him the ring would be ready for him then. No more speeches. I also called my building to put him on the do not let in without me present list. Then I turned my phone to do not disturb and slept on my best friend's couch under a blanket that smelled like her lavender detergent, not like my own house, which suddenly felt like a crime scene. The camping trip happened anyway. At 1:30 in the morning, do not disturb hiccuped for a repeated caller. It was his friend. His voice was a whisper I could barely hear over bar noise and a jukebox. I'm sorry to call you, but you should know this isn't a campsite. He sent 2 videos. Parking lot, neon vacancy sign, my father's laugh like a broken car horn, 2 women teetering in heels. My ex, pale and sloppy, trailing behind with a look that said both yes and help. I watched both without flinching. When he called again, I picked up and told him, thank you for telling me. Do not call me again. I don't think I've ever sounded more like my age. At 6, my mother called. She never calls that early. Your father didn't come home, she said, voice flat like she'd been ironing the same shirt all night. I told her I knew where he was and that I hoped she had a warm coat. Then I hung up and felt like a monster for a minute before it passed. By 10, I had my proof of how fast rot spreads. My mother showed up at my friend's place with her hair unbrushed and her purse clutched like a life vest. She didn't come inside at first, just stood in the doorway and said, I looked at his tablet. She didn't cry. She handed me her phone with screenshots. Messages from my father to my ex, timestamped the week after Thanksgiving. Rule 1, keep a separate account. Bait money. Don't tell her. She'll only worry. Another, never give them everything, you lose leverage. And then, like a punchline to the dirtiest joke, a photo of a key lying on a napkin, caption copy made. Now you're family. I sat down on the arm of the couch and stared at that photo until the pixels blurred and wove. I asked my mother if she was staying with me. No, she said, and for once it sounded like a word she'd rehearsed. I'm going to my sister's. I made an appointment with a lawyer. She rubbed her fingers over the edge of her phone and added, almost absently, he told me I was being dramatic. That wives don't need to know men's business. It was the calm that scared me. We hugged in the hallway, quick and awkward, and I told her I'd go with her to the appointment if she wanted. She nodded once and left. The civil standby was the next afternoon. 2 officers came, stood in the doorway with the polite boredom of people who have seen this exact scene 100 times. He walked in with a duffel and a face that was trying on 3 different expressions and none of them fit. He went straight to the nightstand and stared at the ring like it had grown there. I had put it in its box on top of a folded dish towel so it wouldn't clatter. He picked it up, opened his mouth, closed it, put the box in his pocket. He headed for the kitchen and grabbed the air fryer and the mixer, gifts from my mother and my aunt, and I said, no. He tried the chair that used to be my grandmother's, and one of the officers cleared his throat and said, "If it's hers, it stays." He asked if we could talk alone for a second. I stood in the doorway while he stood in my living room and offered me a dozen different versions of himself: sorry, angry, joking, pleading. Nothing happened, he said at the end, and I actually laughed, because even if that was true, the rest of it already had. "Your father is not the gravity of my life," he said. I told him, "Then stop orbiting him." The officer checked his watch and said we had 5 minutes left. He took his duffel, his ridiculous new air mattress he'd bought for camping, and the one sweatshirt my dad had forgotten at my place months ago. I watched that sweatshirt go like it was a dead animal being wheeled out. An hour after he left, my father tried my door. I was sitting on the floor with a pile of mail and a laundry basket, and the new deadbolt thunked in a way that made me oddly proud. He jiggled it for a while, knocked like a neighbor, and then did that loud, performative sigh he used to do when a cashier double-bagged his groceries. I didn't move. He slid something under the door, one of those glossy flyers for a fishing expo with a phone number circled and "will get you back to normal" scrawled on it. I kicked it back into the hallway. He called my phone. I let it ring. He left a voicemail that started with "you'll thank me later" and ended with "don't be a stranger." I saved it, because I have a feeling it will be useful when a judge asks why I changed the locks. I started therapy. I sat there and talked about keys and bait money and motel parking lots under buzzing lights, and somewhere in the middle of describing my mother's voice when she said "lawyer," all the numbness cracked and the cry that had been stuck halfway up my throat finally made it out. It didn't feel cathartic. It felt like taking a splinter out that had grown roots. On my way home, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I debated ignoring it, and then picked up. It was the friend from the camping trip, the one who'd sent the videos. He sounded shaky. "I told him not to list you as his emergency contact," he said. But he did. Apparently my ex had tried to drive back this morning after sobering up and had a minor accident merging onto the highway. No one was hurt. He wanted me to come get him. I said no. I sent him the number for a tow and told the friend to stop calling me before I blocked him. And I did. I don't know what crazy looks like from the outside. From the inside, it looks like a stack of tiny, practical decisions in a row. Change the lock. Return the ring. Keep receipts. Save the voicemail. It looks like texting my mother a time to meet her at the lawyer's office and then turning my phone off and making pasta in my own kitchen without worrying who has a key to the door. It looks like folding new sheets onto my bed and sleeping through the night without the sound of a key in a lock waking me up like a gunshot. Update 3. My mother didn't ask me to come to the lawyer, she texted the address and the time like a doctor's appointment. The office was over a nail salon that smelled like acetone and orange slices. The lawyer had a plant that didn't know it was winter and a printer that coughed every few minutes. She listened, took notes, and pushed a packet across the desk that said "temporary orders" in a font that looked tired. My mother's hand didn't shake when she signed. Mine did, holding the pen she didn't need. We went straight to the bank. The lobby carpeting had that hotel hush and the teller used the same voice you use with a skittish dog. My mother slid her ID across the counter like it weighed 10 pounds. "I need to freeze accounts in my name," she said, and when they pulled up the list, there it was. Secondary checking with a nickname, Tackle. He really called it that. The banker asked if we wanted to notify the joint account holder. My mother said, no, and the way she said it made the woman on the other side of the glass look up like she'd heard thunder. He still found out. He came into the branch 13 minutes later, of course he did, because his phone told him something stopped moving. He wore the same windbreaker he'd worn to every school open house and called out, "Ladies," like he'd walked into a barbecue. He put his hand on the partition and said to my mother, "We'll discuss this at home." She didn't turn to him. She kept looking at the banker and said, "Please finish." Security came over. He tried that laugh that sounds like a bad starter and asked the guard if he liked football. The guard said, "Sir, step back." I watched my father be escorted out of a bank like a man who had leaned on a display of oranges and sent them all rolling. My mother's shoulders lifted once and settled. The lawyer filed for exclusive use of the house the same afternoon. We stopped by a hardware store where the clerk had a tattoo of a snake wrapped around his wrist and no interest in anyone's drama. He handed over new locks in a paper bag and said, "Flathead'll do you fine." We waited in the car until my father left to go walk his head off. We changed out the deadbolt in 5 minutes while the dog watched, head tilted. I found 3 spare keys hung on a tack behind a framed photo of my 6th grade graduation. One was labeled garage. One was labeled boat. One was unlabeled. I put the unlabeled one in my pocket and didn't tell my mother until later, when we were eating saltines at her sister's kitchen table like communion. I went to the courthouse for myself the next morning with a folder, texts, the motel video, screenshots of "Has she cracked yet?" and the voicemail that started with "You'll thank me later." The clerk had coffee breath and very tired eyes. The judge clicked her pen twice, read silently, and said, "I'm granting the temporary protective order. Service will be arranged." I sat on a plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like dust and pine sol, watching a man argue with a vending machine, and felt a kind of hollow relief. When the process server called me at dinner, he sounded cheerful. "Got him at the grocery store by the nectarines," he said, like he'd won a carnival prize. My ex mailed the ring back in a padded envelope with no return address and the kind of handwritten T that looks like a cross. No note. The box felt heavier than it had on my nightstand. The stone had a nick on the girdle I hadn't noticed before, or maybe it was new and maybe it wasn't. I put it in the freezer next to a bag of peas and a bottle of vodka, like an artifact that needed cold to keep it from evaporating. The friend from the camping trip called from an unknown number I almost ignored. He didn't waste time with apologies. "You should see this," he said, and texted me screenshots of a group chat with the deer emoji as the name. The top message was my father. Rule 2, cash always, never your card. Make it a joke if she asks. Underneath was a grainy photo of a key sitting on a bar napkin. Same photo my mother had already shown me. Same napkin brand as the motel. I forwarded everything to my mother's lawyer. She replied, "Received. Useful. See you Friday." My father tried to beat the order. He went to my building at noon, before the papers reached his hand. The new deadbolt did that satisfying thunk again, and the camera the super installed sent me a clip of my father's face in a fisheye oval, looking old in a way that had nothing to do with time. He held up the Fishing Expo flyer like it was a pardon and slid it under the door again, as if it would try harder the second time. 30 minutes later, the process server got him at the store. At 2, the call started up from his phone and then from a number I didn't recognize. When the service proof came through, I blocked both. The quiet that followed was physical. It felt like someone had shut off a leaf blower 3 houses down. At my parents' house, the temporary order gave my mother the right to tell him to leave. He didn't believe it. He stood in the doorway with a duffel and said, "You can't be serious," and she said, "I am," and a sheriff's deputy stood on the porch plucking lint off his own sleeve and said, "Sir," in a tone that sounded like gravity. My father made one last lap around the kitchen, opened the junk drawer, and took nothing. He looked at the refrigerator like it might say something. He walked out with his duffel and no keys, and my mother locked the door with the new lock and leaned her forehead against the wood for exactly 1 second before she went to the sink and washed a spoon. We started inventorying. My aunt had a notebook. I opened a shoebox in the hall closet and found a stack of napkins, motel branded, folded into crisp squares like origami, each with a date and a first name written in my father's starved handwriting. The top one said Cindy, 8/22. The bottom one said nothing, just an oily ring like a halo. My mother put on nitrile gloves, the same blue from when she used to dye my hair in the kitchen sink, and slid the box into a garbage bag without looking at me. Later, in the den, she pulled the wedding album off the shelf and took the photos out one by one. She didn't rip them. She just stacked them face down until the book was empty cloth and paper. "Keep the album," she said, and I did. I ran into him once, by accident, at the hardware store getting a second set of window latches. He was in the fasteners aisle, staring at screws like they owed him money. He saw me and did that smile that wants to be a detour. "We can fix this," he said, like we were standing over a wobbly table. I said, "No," and reached over him for the box of 3-inch wood screws. He flinched like I'd hit him even though I hadn't moved any faster than a person reaching for cereal. The cashier asked if I wanted a bag. I said no and carried the screws out in my hand like a talisman. My ex tried one more time. He left a voicemail that looped back on itself. "Nothing happened, I panicked, I miss you, I didn't know how to say no to your dad." He said your dad like the words tasted funny. I deleted it without saving. Maybe that was petty. Maybe it was a tiny mercy for me. Therapy this week felt less like splinters and more like sitting in a room and realizing the window opens. I talked about the feeling of a key turning and how quiet sounds when it's yours. My therapist asked me what normal looks like now. I said, "It looks like checking my mail without looking over my shoulder. It looks like helping my mother pick out a set of plates that are just hers and loading them into a trunk that smells like dryer sheets and rain. It looks like my mother texting me a photo of a lease with her name and the right date and a dumb little decorative flourish under the landlord's signature. It looks like the dog's bed in a new corner and his head on my mother's foot while she eats toast at her sister's table. I don't know what will happen when the temporary becomes permanent. I don't know what he will try next. I know where my ring is. I know who has keys to my door. I know my mother's lawyer's first name and the way she taps her pen on the table when she's thinking. I know that when I boiled pasta tonight, I measured the salt with my hand and didn't once think about whether someone else had used that hand to copy a key. I ate on the counter, standing, and when the camera picked up motion at my door at 9, it was just my neighbor's cat doing its rounds like a security guard with whiskers. I breathed all the way down. Update 4. The hearing for the long order was at 9 in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and peppermint. The flag in the corner looked tired. My father wore the windbreaker, of course, and called the judge ma'am like he was ordering coffee. He tried a joke about variety, the same one he always thinks lands, and the judge didn't even flick an eyelash. She read the screenshots, the motel video, the text with "Is she cracked yet?" and asked him if he'd copied a key to my apartment. He said, "I may have made a safety copy," like he was talking about a recipe card. The judge clicked her pen, twice, and granted the 1 year without even raising her voice. When she told him that contacting me through third parties also counted as contact, he said, "Even her fiancé?" And then realized the word he'd used and shut his mouth like a drawer. My mother's status conference was in the room next door, same hum from the fluorescent lights, Different starched suit behind the table. The lawyer used the words dissipation of assets and slid the photo of the napkin across like she was laying down a card that ended the hand. He tried to get cute about boys' trips. The judge said, "Sir, your boys' trips have receipts. Exclusive use stayed. Temporary support set." The bank account with the fishing nickname made the bailiff's mouth twitch even though he was trying so hard to be a wall. When they asked about the boat, my father said, "It's in storage," and my mother said, "It's impounded for an expired registration," and I thought, of course it is. I took the ring out of the freezer the next day. The box stuck to my fingers for a second like a tongue on a pole. I brought it to a little jewelry shop with a bell that had given up. The woman behind the counter had a loop and a patience that felt like a blanket. She turned the stone in the light and said words that felt like déjà vu, filled, treated, not what it was sold as. She named a number that was both fair and insulting. I didn't haggle. "Can you melt the band?" I asked, and she looked at me like she'd been waiting for that question all week. "We don't do it while you wait," she said, "but we can turn it into something else." 2 weeks later she handed me a small envelope with 2 tiny gold discs punched out of the band, each the size of a lentil. One for me, one for my mother. Mine catches the light when I wash dishes. Hers sits against her collarbone like a secret that belongs to us. The message I had been dreading arrived sideways. A girl with my father's eyebrows and none of his swagger knocked on my mother's sister's door while we were there putting together a flat-pack bookshelf that kept insisting it wanted to be a parallelogram. She was 23 if she was anything, with a printout from a DNA site and a photo of her mother at a county fair in a year that made my stomach drop. The paper said we were close family, first cousin or half-sister. Her voice had that light shake of someone who had rehearsed every version of this moment and none of them fit what actually happened. I made tea because that is what you do when your brain can't compute. We sat at my aunt's table with the dog asleep under my mother's knee. The girl said her mother's name and I saw it written on a motel napkin in that starved handwriting. I told her I wasn't the keeper of him. I told her what he was to me. I gave her my mother's lawyer's card and I didn't give her my father's number. We exchanged our own. When she left, she walked down the front steps like she was learning how to use them. Later, in the car, my mother held that little gold disc at her neck and said, very softly, "I hope she gets a better ending." The order got tested within 48 hours, of course it did. He sent a message through someone else like a kid trying to slip a note in class. My ex forwarded me a screenshot, "Your little act is done. Family is family." He added nothing to it, no apology, which I appreciated. I saved it and sent it to the prosecutor's office with the case number the clerk had written on a post-it in blue ink. A sergeant with a voice like a gravel road called that afternoon and said, "He knows better," in a way that meant he was going to go learn it the hard way. By dinner they had him in the lobby of a strip mall gym where he'd gone to clear his head, whatever that means. He called the arrest a misunderstanding. The report called it a violation. I stirred sauce and read the text that said served and slept that night all the way like my body finally believed my locks. My mother signed a lease. I carried boxes into a third-floor walk-up that smelled like paint and possibility. She picked plates with blue stripes that she would have called impractical 2 months ago. The dog figured out the spot under the window where the sun hit the rug and claimed it like land. We hung curtains wrong the first time and laughed so hard we couldn't fix them for a minute. Her neighbor slid a pan of brownies under the door with a sticky note that said welcome in cartoon letters. We sat on the floor with brownie crumbs on our socks and my mother said, "I want my grandmother's rocking chair," and then, a second later, "I won't fight over anything he wants just to watch me fight." I said, "We'll make a list," and we didn't. We took a photo of the dog in his new corner instead. I changed my name. Not on social media, not in my contacts. I went and took a number at the office with the hard chairs and the television that plays the same segment about online safety on loop. I filled out the form and wrote my mother's last name in the box and practiced saying it in my head until it stopped sounding like a costume. The clerk had hair that curled at the ends and a coffee ring on her desk. She checked my ID and said, "Any relation?" When she saw the old name and I said, "Not anymore," and realized I meant it as a fact and not a jab. She stamped something and slid it back to me and I felt the floor of my life come up to meet my feet. He is quieter now, which I don't trust but will take. The camera caught him once the week after the arrest from too far away, walking on the opposite side of the street like a man who had heard about a cliff and wanted to know where it was without falling over it. He looked up and then looked away fast enough to make his neck crease. I have the clip saved in the same folder as the napkin photo and the motel video and my mother's lease and the invoice from the jeweler. It's a strange little archive, and it's mine. The last thing, the friend from the so-called trip dropped a paper bag on my doormat with no note. Inside were 4 keys on a fishing lure keychain and a bar napkin, blank. The keys were to old locks, my old deadbolt, my parents' old back door, the garage in a house we don't live in anymore. I held them and they felt like teeth. I put them in a bowl on the counter and then I took them to the hardware store and watched them disappear into the scrap bin with a hollow sound that was not dramatic, not symbolic to anyone but me. On my walk home it started to rain, the soft kind that makes the street look cleaner. When I got to my building, the cat was there under the awning, looking offended at the weather. I opened the door and it shot in like it owned the place. I laughed. Out loud. It felt like there was more room in my mouth for it than there used to be. Update 5. The storage unit shows up on a printout like a typo. You store monthly, $59, hitting a card my mother thought was only for groceries. We don't have a unit, she says, and her lawyer says, you do now, and faxes over a preservation order that makes the manager stop pretending he can't read. A deputy meets us there and signs the clipboard like it's a package. The hallway smells like rubber and dust and somebody's forgotten Christmas. The manager cuts the lock with bolt cutters that look heavy enough to hurt someone who deserves it. The door rattles up. Inside is a small country of things that don't belong anywhere: plastic totes, a folding chair, a cooler, a coil of extension cord. On the back wall, a benchtop key machine sits on a milk crate. It has metal filings glittering in its throat like sugar. The deputy looks at it and says, haven't seen one of those in the wild in a while, and my mother rests her hand on the nearest tote like she might tip over. We don't touch much. We take photos, a tackle box full of blank keys in little sleeves, each one with a tiny shark mouth stamped where the teeth would be. A coffee can of key shavings, silver as fish scales. A manila envelope of napkins with names in my father's starved handwriting, dates in the corner like someone was keeping score. The top tote is filled with flyers: fishing expo, car wash, the kind of paper that lives under magnets. The second one has a shoe box with labeled rings, back, side, office. Zumba. I don't let myself imagine Zumba. We call the lawyer from the hallway. Photograph, seal, leave, she says. We'll get an inventory and a court order to move. My mother nods like she's been training for this exact instruction. On the way out, the manager tries a joke about men and hobbies and his voice dies in the cinder block. The deputy closes the door and slides a bright red seal over the new lock like a band-aid. He tries to be clever about the order. He can't step on my building's property, so he leaves a cooler tucked under the rear bumper of my car at the grocery store. When I reverse, it drags and makes a sound like a low groan. Inside are two bass eyeing the sky and a folded paper towel with Miss Our Trips in Sharpie. I take a picture with my phone hand steady and then I call the non-emergency line and use the phrase restraining order violation and it lands like a key turning. A patrol car swings into the lot. The officer asks if I want the fish. I say no. He says, me neither, and double bags the cooler like hazardous waste. They get him an hour later at a strip mall barber shop, hands up like he's showing the barber how much hair to take off. The charge isn't big. It's big enough. Work finds out because he calls the front desk pretending to be my uncle and asks for my schedule. The receptionist has the kind of voice that can slice a steak. She sends me an email with a recorded voicemail attached and I forward it to the prosecutor with the case number and the subject line additional contact. The reply is quick: received. We'll include it. My boss calls me in, shuts the door, and says, take the time you need, like a sentence someone had to practice for someone else but now it's mine. They add my workplace to the order. Security puts a photo at the desk. My father is framed behind plastic like an exhibit. He still has fans. His sister texts me a paragraph that starts with family is complicated and ends with he's your father, and I put my phone face down and go water the plant I'm trying not to kill. Later I send her the photo of the key machine and one of the napkins with a date from the year she made me a lemonade stand sign with bubble letters. She writes back, I didn't know. Maybe she didn't. I don't have to teach her. The girl with my father's eyebrows texts from a number I saved as her name and nothing else. She took the test. We are what the paper said we were. She doesn't want to meet him. She wants to know if it's okay to meet me again. We get coffee at a place that burns everything a little. She brings a photo in a cracked frame, a woman at a county fair holding a baby whose hand is a starfish on her shirt. The man next to her is 25 and wearing the windbreaker he is still wearing at 55. He has his hand in his pocket and a look like he already has a joke ready in case someone asks a hard question. I say, he won't give you what you want, because I wish someone had said it to me when I was 7 and when I was 17 and when I was 27. She nods once and puts the photo back inside her tote bag like she's putting away a piece of a map that leads nowhere. We walk past a store with a wall of keys. We keep walking. My mother's divorce has a calendar now. Mediation on a Tuesday that smells like dry erase markers and someone's cinnamon gum. He shows up with a spiral notebook and a new pen and no lawyer, like charm could do paperwork. The mediator has a cardigan the color of wet cement and the patience of a professional bridge. Marital property, she says when he tries to talk about loyalty. Disclosure, she says when he tries to talk about boys' trips. She asks about accounts and he says he is what he has, and then my mother's lawyer slides a page across with 3 lines of transactions to a storage facility and an insurance payment for a boat in a county 2 hours away. It's in storage, he says. It's impounded, my mother says, not looking at him, and the mediator writes something and says, we'll stipulate to sale with proceeds in escrow, like a spell. He says he wants the dog. The mediator says, the dog is property, and then, very gently, and the dog has been with your wife. He deflates around the eyes. I study the carpet pattern until it stops moving. The process server for the storage unit calls with a voice that finds joy where it can. Got the order, he says. You want me there when you move it? We go with a moving truck and a second deputy and a roll of matte black Sharpie. We label what we have too. We leave the key machine on its milk crate for the inventory photos and then the deputy unplugs it like it's a feral appliance. He watches me watching it and says, it's just metal, Like a blessing or a warning. We take the napkins in a banker's box and I sit in the passenger seat with it on my lap like something alive. At the lawyer's office, the paralegal slides it under her desk and says, "Evidence," to the rhythm of a heartbeat. My ex pops up once more like a cork in a sink. He emails from a brand new address that uses a number he must think makes him invisible. He says he's moving out of state, he says he's sorry, he says he's in a program with a name that sounds like a gym. He says he didn't know how to say no. I don't write back. I drag the email into a folder called log and I close the laptop and I make dinner. My mother and I go back to the house with the deputy to do the last big sweep for things that are hers. The rocking chair that was my great-grandmother's, the quilt that has a pattern that looks like a bunch of X's hugging each other. She sets the chair in the back of my hatchback and puts her hand on the worn arm and says, "I sat in this with you when you had the fever that would not break, like the past is a thing you can point to and measure." The deputy checks a list and says, "You're good," and my mother locks the door and doesn't press her forehead to it this time. She just turns and walks away. The dog does a small hop like a person who wants to clap and doesn't. I go to therapy and say the word sister and it doesn't snag on anything on its way out of my mouth. My therapist asks me what I want to do with my father's name on documents I haven't approached yet. I think about the keys turned into scrap, the ring turned into lentils, the napkins turned into evidence, and I say, I want it to be a trail you can't follow. She nods and writes something down I don't need to read. He is quiet in the way a person is quiet when they have been told a stove is hot and they don't entirely believe it. The camera catches strangers and delivery drivers and the cat that thinks it is a night shift manager. The only time something familiar pulls at my stomach is a glimpse of a windbreaker sleeve on a man who is not him. It passes. I sleep. In the morning, I take my mug to the window and there is a new sound in the building. My neighbor practicing piano, hesitant at first and then, finding the notes. It sounds like someone learning their own house. I stand there and drink my coffee and for once nothing in me is braced for a key in a lock that doesn't belong.